The second video this week is on something you probably haven't seen a lot of. It's something that we talked about in the pre-algebra classes, and I want to talk about here because looking over some of the concepts that you'll see in 8th grade, square roots is one of those things. So I want to introduce them here this week. It's helpful if you have a scientific calculator, or at least have a calculator in front of you, because there are some problems where it's going to be really beneficial for you to plug them into a calculator. They're going to be things that you can't answer mentally or off the top of your head. If you don't have a scientific calculator, you probably do have a square root key on the computer calculator. Also on your cell phone calculator, there should be a square root key there, so you can also use that. But normally in class, we'd be using our scientific calculators. So I want to talk about what square roots are. In fact, I'm going to introduce first to you the perfect squares. These are numbers that are the squares of integers. So examples of perfect squares are actually down below as well, include 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, etc., because there are numbers that we get when we square integers. So 1 to the second power is 1, 2 to the second power is 4, 3 to the second power is 9, 4 to the second power is 16, 5 to the second power is 25, and so forth. And the reason why this is important is because when I take the square root of a perfect square, I get a whole number, I get an integer, and that's going to be important for us. You're going to see some problems here today where you should be able to calculate them without or find them without a calculator. There's others where we're trying to find the square root of a number that's not a perfect square. Then you're going to get those weird decimals. So we'll talk about that. So the square root symbol or radical sign is this guy. It kind of looks like a check mark. You might have seen it on your calculator before. But a square root is one of two equal factors of a number. So this is the definition, which I know sounds kind of complicated, so we'll try to simplify it for you. If x squared equals y, then x is a square root of y. Whoa, okay. Let's break this down. First of all, every positive number has both a positive and a negative square root. We'll talk a little bit more about that next year. Some other things. You cannot take the square root of a negative number. The square of a number cannot be negative. So if I say, what's the square root of negative 36? There's no number that when I multiply it by itself will get you negative 36, because a positive times a positive gets you a positive, and a negative times a negative gets you a positive. So if you were asked to find the square root of a negative number, which we will in a few moments, you're going to write no real solution or does not exist. We'll talk more about that when we see some examples, so bear with me. A square root of a number that is not a perfect square is not going to be a whole number. It's going to be an irrational number. That's a decimal that goes on forever without a repeating pattern to it. So if I say, what's the square root of 1? That's going to be 1. If I say, what's the square root of 4? That's going to be 2. The square root of 9 is going to be 3. These numbers are perfect squares. But if I ask you for the square root of a number that's between any of these, it is not going to be a whole number or an integer. It's going to be a long decimal that doesn't repeat. It goes on forever without some sort of pattern to it. So let's do some examples. And again, bear with me. It seems kind of complicated at first, but I assure you it's not. So number one, when I say what's the square root of 25, this isn't a division symbol, it's a square root symbol. I'm asking you, what number to the second power gets you 25? Or what number when I multiply it by itself gets me 25? If you were thinking 5, you're correct, because 5 times 5 gets me 25. For number 2, I've got the square root of 49. What number when I multiply it by itself gets me 49? If you were thinking 7, you're correct. 7 times 7 is 49. Now I've got a negative outside the square root symbol. That's fine. What's the square root of 169? Meaning, what number when I multiply it by itself gets me 169? This one's a little harder. If you recognize that that's 13, you're correct. And then all I do is I put the negative sign in front of that 13. So it'll be negative 13. Now, this symbol might be new for you. It's a plus or minus symbol, and that's how we read it, plus or minus, meaning a positive answer and a negative answer. This is used a lot of times in real life. For example, It's an election year, so during election polls, a lot of times they'll put out those statistics and those results, and they'll say plus or minus 3%, plus or minus 8%, meaning the actual results could be up to 8% more or up to 8% less than whatever value they found in the poll. That's their percent of error. Okay, so it is something you will see or could perhaps see in real life. So when I say plus or minus square root of 9, I'm saying what number multiplied by itself gives you 9? 3. All you do is you put the plus or minus symbol in front of it, meaning that positive 3 and negative 3 are both solutions. Number 5, negative square root of 100. What number multiplied by itself gives you 100? If you were thinking 10, you're correct. Don't forget to pop that negative sign right in front. Number 6, plus or minus square root of 144. What number multiplied by itself gets you 144? If you were thinking 12, you're correct. Just pop that plus or minus sign in front to get plus or minus 12. Number 7, the square root of x squared. This one's kind of weird, but if I take the square root of x squared, think about if I took number 1, for example. This could be written as the square root of 5 squared, and that's 5. So what do you think the square root of x squared is? If you were thinking x, you're correct. Don't panic too much about that. These other problems are more important. Number 8, the square root of negative 64. What number squared gives you negative 64? Well, there is no number that when you multiply it by itself, it will get you negative 64, because 8 times 8 is 64. Negative 8 times negative 8 is also 64. Because remember, a negative times a negative gets us a positive. So this solution does not exist. So the square root of a negative number does not exist, except in the imaginary number world. And yes, that does exist. We're not going to talk about imaginary numbers right now, but if you happen to take Algebra 2 in high school, you will talk about the imaginary number system, which oddly enough does exist. You can't make it up, I swear. All right, independent practice. Pause the video, give these 4 a try without a calculator. All right, hopefully you've completed these 4 questions. Number 1, the negative square root of 121 is negative 11. Since the square root of 121 is 11, tack the negative sign in the front of that. Plus or minus square root of 64. 8 times 8 gets me 64, so this is plus or minus 8. We already saw square root of 49, that's 7. And then number 4, because the negative is inside the square root, that does not exist. If the negative were outside the square root, we'd be okay, but this one is inside, which means it does not exist, or you can say no real solution. Now, I want to talk about how to calculate square roots using your calculator. That's our next section. So I took screenshots of the most commonly used calculators so that you could find your square root key. So it looks like that got messed up a little bit there. So this is the ones we had in the classroom. The square root key is actually above the x squared key, which we use during the regular classroom setting. To get that, though, you have to hit the second key or shift and then the x squared button, and the square root key will pop up. And then you'll plug in your number and hit equals. If you have one of these, it's in the same spot, so second and then the x squared key, put your number in, hit equals, or enter in this case. Here's the problem with this. Your calculator is probably going to give you a weird looking answer. So if you type in the square root of 8, it's going to say 2 root 2. You want a decimal. So you're going to need to press this double arrow down in the bottom right hand corner. That's a really important key for us. We've talked about it in the classroom as well. So you will definitely want to make sure you press that. That will get you the decimal. This calculator, I know a handful of you have this one. This one's kind of weird because you actually have to put the number in first and then you just hit the square root key and it'll give you your answer. And then the last calculator, and I know I'm not showing every single type of calculator, unfortunately I can't. Last couple of years I haven't seen a lot of different calculators. These are the most common ones that I see. For this one, you're going to type in your number, hit the square root key, type in your number, hit equals. But again, you'll get something weird like this for a lot of them. So if you want the decimal, hit this key, the S to D key. That will change it to a decimal for you. All right, so let's try some examples. And you may want to practice this on your calculator as we go through these. So number 9, use a calculator to find each square root to the nearest tenth. That means one number after the decimal point. So number 9, I have a negative square root of 141. When I plug it into my calculator, now I just put in square root of 141, and then I put a negative on my solution, I'm going to get about 11.9. And keep in mind, I rounded this to the nearest tenth. Number 10, square root of 0.5. Should get you about 0.7 in your calculator, which I know seems kind of weird. It became bigger, but if I multiply 2 decimals less than 1, my number actually becomes smaller. So that's where the 0.5 will come from. Number 11, plus or minus the square root of 89. Please do not try looking for a plus or minus key on your calculator. Just do the square root of 89 and put the plus or minus sign in front of it. This should get you about 9.4. Keep in mind the squiggly equal sign just represents that it's about equal to. It tells me that I rounded my answer. Number 12, square root of 490. If we plug it in, you should get about 22.1. Number 13, the negative square root of 5.08 is going to get us about negative 2.3. And number 14, the square root of 1,125 gets us about 33.5. So again, practice plugging that into your calculator. One place that I can help you if you're really struggling with that is bringing a calculator to the Zoom office hours. I can try to help you as best as I can there. Ask mom or dad as well. They might also be able to point you in the right direction. So our last set of questions, this is modeled after your second assignment, which is pretty short. It's based on this. We're going to order each set of numbers from least to greatest, and you may use a calculator for these. So I will tell you specifically on the assignment, and I have to kind of trust you on this, whether you can or cannot use your calculators. If I say not to use a calculator, please try doing it without using a calculator because it's not going to benefit you to use it if I'm asking you not to. So number 15, I've got the numbers 6.7, square root of 40, and 6.5. So 6.7 is obviously 6.7. Square root of 40 in my calculator is about 6.32. 6.5, hopefully you realize 1/2 is 0.5, is 6.5. So my smallest is at 6.32. I like to make them all decimals because I think it's easiest to compare them that way. So square root of 40 is my smallest at 6.32. Then 6.5 or 6.5 comes next. And I do like to write them as they were in the problem. And then my largest is 6.7. Number 16, I have square root of 76, 8 3/5, and 8.8. So square root of 76 is about 8.71 if I plug it into my calculator. 8 3/5 is 8.6. And you might be thinking, how did you know that? I did 3 divided by 5 to get 0.6 and put that together to get 8.6. Or maybe you know that 8 3/5 is 8 6/10. That's fine too. 8.8 is equivalent to 8.8. My smallest is my 8.6, my 8 3/5, followed by the square root of 76 at 8.71, a little bit larger. And then finally my largest is 8.8. Number 17, last one. I've got 3.9, 3 2/3, and square root of 14. So 3.9 is 3.9. 3 2/3 is 3.6 repeating. So 2 divided by 3 is 0.66666. Your calculator might throw up a 7 at the end. There's not really a 7. It's just cutting that decimal off at some point. And then the square root of 14 is about 3.74. So my smallest is the 3.6 repeating, or 3 2/3, followed by the square root of 14, followed by 3.9. Now, I do have one last question. I just realized I said these were the last questions. There's one more. My fault. Number 18, I do expect that you're able to do this without a calculator. It says, which point on the number line best represents square root of 84? So you can plug it into your calculator, but let's think about this. So let's think of some perfect squares. So I've got like 7 squared is 49, 8 squared is 64, 9 squared is going to get me 81. So I know that it's probably pretty close to 9, but it's going to be a little bit above 9, which eliminates choices A and B. I know 10 squared is 100, and I know that 84 is a lot closer to 81, which is what 9 to the second power is, than to 100, which is what 10 to the second power is. So I know that it's actually going to be pretty close to 9, which gives me a pretty good indication that point C is going to be where the square root of 84 is. Now you could actually calculate square root of 84, figure out what it is. It should get you a little bit above 9, but not quite halfway between 9 and 10. So it gives you a pretty good idea that point C is the best. There's nothing like this on your assignment, but I know that when I was looking ahead to some of the 8th grade materials, I did see some problems similar to this for next year. So this is really just trying to get you ready to go for next school year. So don't panic too much about this one, but the rest of the problems are fair game for your assignment. Thanks for listening.